People romanticize the sensation of profound wonder. They label it magic. They call it a mystical connection to the universe. But here is the brutal physical reality. There is absolutely no magic involved. What you are actually experiencing is a strict, mechanical neurological regression. Your brain is temporarily shutting down its default mode network. This is the specific neural circuit responsible for generating your ego. It is the biological structure that separates you from the outside world. When this network collapses, your adult identity vanishes. You are instantly plunged backward in biological time. You revert completely to the exact neurological baseline of your own infancy. You enter a state of pure, borderless, pre-verbal sensory chaos. Watch closely how an adult reacts in this state. A 40-year-old individual sits inside a silent concert hall. Live orchestral music physically vibrates through the space. The acoustic frequency of the string section begins to swell. Instantly, their autonomic nervous system overrides conscious control. Spontaneous lacrimation begins. Tears fall from their eyes without any cognitive permission. Their basal respiratory rate drops significantly. The diameter of their pupils expands by several millimeters. Piloerection rapidly occurs across the dermis of both forearms. Their skin physically alters its texture in response to raw auditory data. Someone approaches them and asks why they are crying. They cannot formulate a single coherent sentence. The language centers of their prefrontal cortex are temporarily offline. They physically grasp the center of their own sternum. They desperately search for vocabulary that no longer exists in that brain state. They can only shake their head in complete silence. This profound, wordless state feels euphoric when the physical environment is safe. It is simply your nervous system remembering how to exist before language. But this forces us to confront a devastating biological question. What exactly happens to the human organism in this specific state? What happens when that exact same pre-verbal, entirely defenseless neural configuration is subjected to absolute inescapable terror? Before you acquired semantic language, you did not possess episodic memory. Your brain did not record reality as a sequence of events. There was no timeline. There was no narrative. There was only a continuous, unfiltered flood of raw sensory data. Your entire existence was purely physiological. During the first 36 months of your life, your brain operated in a very specific electrical frequency. It functioned almost exclusively in theta brainwaves. This is an oscillation between 4 and 8 Hz. It is the exact neurological signature of an adult in deep hypnosis. It perfectly mirrors the brain state of rapid eye movement sleep. Inside this frequency, your hippocampus is radically underdeveloped. This is the precise brain region responsible for organizing chronological events. Because it is largely offline, you cannot stamp an experience as existing in the past. But the amygdala is completely operational. The primitive alarm center that calculates immediate biological threats is fully online. At this stage of development, your default mode network has not yet formed. There is absolutely no neurological boundary between the concept of self and other. You do not observe your environment. You absorb it. You literally ingest your surroundings on a cellular level. Without a functioning prefrontal cortex to filter incoming stimuli, a terrifying mechanical reality occurs. Every single environmental shift is processed as a direct physical alteration of your own biological state. Watch closely how this plays out in real time. An infant lies flat on a woven rug. A ceiling fan rotates directly above them. The infant's limbs move in asynchronous, jerky patterns. As the fan spins, it casts alternating shadows across the infant's face. The infant's gaze locks onto the shifting light. They do not possess the cognition to identify a fan. Instead, their basal breathing rate automatically synchronizes with the rhythmic visual stimulus. Then, a sudden anomaly occurs. A loud metallic crash violently echoes from the next room in less than 200 milliseconds. The infant's entire body achieves complete rigidity. Their arms violently splay outward in the automatic Moro reflex. Their fingers open wide, desperately grasping at empty air. Their heart rate spikes from 90 to 180 beats per minute instantly. There is absolutely no cognitive assessment of the noise. No thought process occurs. Their entire physiology simply becomes the shockwave. The actual fatal mechanism is this total lack of biological separation. Because the infant cannot categorize danger, they cannot distance themselves from it. A hostile environment does not just temporarily frighten the child. It literally overwrites the baseline setting of their central nervous system. This boundless neurological absorption is the precise foundation of human connection when an environment is safe. But when that environment turns chronically threatening, the biology is forced to adapt. The physical inability to mentally separate from the terror creates a permanent adaptation. It engineers a catastrophic biological deformation. Pre-verbal trauma is never recorded as a memory. It is never stored as a sequence of events. It is permanently encoded as a structural deformation. It physically warps the architecture of the autonomic nervous system. When a pre-verbal child is exposed to chronic instability, when they endure neglect or active abuse, a highly specific biological cascade is triggered. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is thrust into hyperactivation. It floods the developing brain with glucocorticoids. This chemical flood is predominantly cortisol. But here is the brutal physical reality. In a developing brain, chronic cortisol is severely neurotoxic. It actively damages the hippocampus. It suppresses its physical growth. This prevents the brain from timestamping the trauma. The nervous system literally loses the ability to categorize the threat as being in the past. Simultaneously, the amygdala undergoes hypertrophy. The primitive threat center physically increases in volume. It locks the entire organism into a persistent, lifelong state of hyperarousal. The child does not form a psychological memory of abuse. Their nervous system adopts a new biological baseline. The environment is permanently calculated as a lethal, active threat. Watch closely how this structural deformation operates decades later. A 32-year-old professional sits in an open-plan office. They are focused on a computer screen. 20 feet away, a colleague aggressively slams a heavy binder onto a wooden desk. Within 1.5 seconds, the professional's physiology completely alters. Their shoulders elevate sharply toward their ears. Their respiration instantly shifts. Deep diaphragmatic breathing ceases completely. Rapid, shallow clavicular breathing takes over. Their heart rate spikes from 70 to 115 beats per minute. They instantly break eye contact with the screen. They rapidly scan the room for a predator. Then, they execute a highly specific behavioral loop. They turn to a completely different coworker sitting nearby. They immediately offer an unprompted, desperate apology for an unrelated, minor issue. This is not a conscious social choice. This is an automatic, involuntary autonomic reaction. It is the biological fawn response. It bypasses conscious thought entirely. This individual moves through the adult world with a hijacked nervous system. Their biology constantly hallucinates the presence of an invisible predator. They are utterly devoid of the cognitive context to explain why they feel hunted. They lack the vocabulary to name the terror. But the human organism cannot sustain maximum biological defense indefinitely. This unnameable, circulating terror has no narrative outlet. It must inevitably breach the surface. It will force its way out through catastrophic cellular decay and unconscious eruption. Implicit trauma memories do not simply vanish. If they cannot be articulated verbally, they must mutate. They inevitably manifest as severe somatic symptom disorders. They trigger cascading autoimmune failures. They generate highly abstract, violent night terrors. The concept that the body keeps the score is not a metaphor. It is a literal, measurable immunological reality. Chronic, unresolved activation of the HPA axis has a severe physical cost. It forces the organism into a permanent state of systemic inflammation. The bloodstream is continuously flooded with pro-inflammatory cytokines. Specific inflammatory markers like Interleukin-6 and TNF-alpha skyrocket. The conscious mind lacks the vocabulary to process the original terror. Therefore, the central nervous system shunts the distress directly into the physical tissue. And it gets worse when the subject loses consciousness. During rapid eye movement sleep, the prefrontal cortex completely shuts down. The brain's logical suppressor goes completely offline. Without this cognitive suppression, the hyperactive amygdala assumes total control. It violently floods the visual cortex with raw, unprocessed emotional data. There is no chronological, episodic memory to replay. The brain possesses no factual footage of the trauma to screen, so it constructs terrifying, abstract, rapidly shifting symbols. These symbols are mathematically engineered by the nervous system. They exist purely to represent the exact physiological sensation of total infantile helplessness. Watch closely how this structural collapse occurs in the dark. A 28-year-old individual wakes up abruptly at 3:14 a.m. Their bedsheets are entirely saturated with physiological sweat. Their jaw is clenched with maximum mechanical force. The pressure is severe enough to cause acute, lingering masseter muscle pain. They sit up rapidly, gasping aggressively for oxygen. Their eyes dart frantically around the pitch black bedroom. They experience a severe, crushing mechanical pressure directly on their sternum. If interrogated, they cannot recall a single narrative dream. There were no specific faces. There were no clear chronological events. They can only articulate a lingering, overwhelming physical sensation. They describe the physical geometry of the room dissolving. They report a total, terrifying loss of physical gravity. They are consumed by a profound, wordless sense of impending biological annihilation. The unresolved pre-verbal trauma is actively degrading the physical body. It is literally destroying healthy human tissue. Over time, this continuous inflammatory state drives the onset of severe chronic illnesses. Conditions like fibromyalgia and Hashimoto's thyroiditis emerge as direct physical consequences. Severe sleep disturbances push the individual toward a total physiological breakdown. But here is the brutal physical reality. Surviving this escalating physiological decay requires a terrifying intervention. It demands a deliberate, highly calculated descent. You must consciously drop back into the exact infantile void of chaos your brain spent decades trying to escape. Healing is not about remembering the facts of what happened to you, because the brutal physical reality is this: those facts literally do not exist anywhere inside your brain tissue. They were never recorded. True healing is a terrifying, highly calculated process. It is the deliberate choice to willingly re-enter the pre-verbal, ego-less void. Your biology attempted to execute a defensive survival reaction. It tried to scream. It tried to violently shake. It desperately tried to flee a lethal threat. But your physical organism was simply too small. The biological sequence was brutally interrupted. It was frozen directly into your nervous system. The prefrontal cortex cannot reason with the amygdala. Logic cannot override a pure survival mandate. You must completely abandon traditional cognitive behavioral therapy for this. You must discard purely conversational analysis, attempting to assign adult vocabulary to a state that predates human language is completely futile. You must engage the nervous system directly. You must utilize mechanical interventions like Somatic Experiencing or EMDR. Watch closely how you must execute this. When the physical symptoms of the trauma inevitably arise, when the sudden chest tightness hits, when the inexplicable dread floods your entire system, you must immediately cease all attempts to rationalize it. Stop telling yourself you are anxious because of a work deadline. You must sit in absolute, complete silence. Drop the conscious narrative entirely. Focus purely on the raw, physical sensation. Allow your body to shake aggressively. Allow the physiological sweat to pour. Allow the physical weeping to occur. Do not attach a single word to this reaction. Do not invent a story to explain it. Do not offer your brain a single justification. Just allow the biological release to finally complete its cycle. The reality of your past is not hiding in your memories. It is actively circulating in your bloodstream. If you are ready to stop talking about your trauma, if you are ready to start decoding the brutal, silent language of your nervous system, subscribe to this channel. The dissection continues next week.